tonight on All In.
Tell the American people the truth. We need to do a lot more.
President's ISIS plan is out. Republicans want more. One even calling for shock and awe.
A lot of our members think a lot more needs to be done.
Congressman Jack Kingston and Senator Chris Murphy will join me live. Then, Roger Goodell is speaking out again.
We obviously were very disturbed at the first video.
The latest on the investigation of the Ray Rice scandal, as NFL owners signal they may be willing to fire their commissioner. Plus, new details from the two latest Michael Brown shooting witnesses. And there has been a major twist in the story of a young man shot dead in an Ohio Walmart.
Something stinks, and we want justice.
All In starts right now. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. As Washington reacts to President Obama's call for military escalation against ISIS, including the possibility of airstrikes in Syria, the president is taking criticism from a number of different directions, including some prominent Republicans who say his plan doesn't go far enough. We may need combat boots on the ground, American soldiers fighting and dying on the ground, according to certain members of Congress, possibly even in Syria. On the Senate floor today, John McCain argued the president's strategy won't be enough to completely destroy ISIS.
I'm confident that the steps the president laid out last night can degrade ISIS, but that's not sufficient to protect our people. We need special forces and advisors on the ground. We'll soon have more than 1,500 there, and there will have to be more.
While McCain's colleague Lindsey Graham said the mission will require a major commitment by the U.S. military.
There is no way in hell we're going to beat these guys without an American ground component in Iraq and Syria. There is not a force in the Mideast that can take these guys on and win without substantial American help. You don't need the 82nd Airborne, but we're going to need thousands of troops over time on the ground holding the hands of the Arab armies that are going to do the fighting.
And asked today whether he could imagine sending combat troops into Syria, Congressman Paul Ryan responded it should be on the table.
I can imagine doing whatever it takes to finish off ISIS, and if that's what's required, then that's what's required. So I don't think you should ever take options off the table. We've been involved. I've been in Congress for 16 years, and I've learned that there are certain things that you want to give the military the ability to do to actually finish the job.
Meanwhile, Louisiana Congressman John Fleming is essentially calling for a full-on repeat of the Iraq War. Republican telling the National Journal, quote, "I think we would want to see an all-out war. Shock and awe. We put troops on the ground. We put all of our assets there after properly prepping the battlefield. And in a matter of few weeks, we take these guys out and we leave a stay-behind force to keep our friends up and going, and also maybe a no-fly zone in Syria over the area Assad controls." Piece of cake. While Congress seems willing to comply with the president's request for approval to train and equip the Syrian opposition, it's still not clear whether they'll take up a vote on broader authorization for military action. In his primetime address last night, President Obama stopped short of calling on Congress to do so.
I have the authority to address the threat from ISIL, but I believe we are strongest as a nation when the president and Congress work together. So I welcome congressional support for this effort in order to show the world that Americans are united in confronting this danger.
Asked today whether the House intends to vote on a military authorization, Speaker John Boehner simply tossed the question back to the White House.
Now, normally, in such a case, I've been through this a few times over the 24 years that I've been here, the President of the United States would request that support and would supply the wording of a resolution to authorize this force. At this point in time, we've not gotten that request. We've not seen that language.
Earlier this week, Republican Congressman Jack Kingston, who supports holding a vote, told the New York Times why he thinks lawmakers are reluctant to do so. Quote, "A lot of people would like to stay on the sideline and say, just bomb the place and tell us about it later. It's an election year. A lot of Democrats don't know how it would play in their party, and Republicans don't want to change anything. We like the path we're on now. We can denounce it if it goes bad and praise it if it goes well and ask, what took him so long?" And joining me now is Congressman Jack Kingston, Republican of Georgia. Congressman, do you think that's still the prevailing mood inside Congress as they discuss the possibility of a vote?
Chris, I think that the president did a lot last night and has done a lot in the last 24, 48 hours to change that mood. I do believe that there are members in both parties who would rather avoid a vote, and some of it's for political reasons, and some of it's just because, you know, you're darned if you do and darned if you don't when it comes to the Middle East. We get it wrong so many times over there. But I think that now the president would find a lot of allies in both parties who probably would welcome a vote and support a vote. And I think that the advantage to the president, of course he mentioned it last night, it would show that we are united, but it would also put more eyes on the plan, because one of the things that we have learned in a hearing today, a briefing, is that the airstrikes and the training will not be enough, that we are going to have coalition forces that step up and fill in the gap and squeeze ISIS. And I don't think if we're not going to have troops on the ground, we're not going to be able to have that happen. And I think most of us are saying, well, we've got to get our coalition partners to have equal skin in the game, which may mean troops and definitely means money.
So do you agree with some fellow Republicans who are calling openly for ground troops, at least not taking ground troops off the table, or sending in combat troops, or even your colleague, Mr. Fleming, who basically says we should just be declaring all-out war, just go in there?
Well, I think that to put it on the table is appropriate when you look at the task that's in front of us. And I'll say this, Chris, you know, President Clinton effectively used airstrikes in Bosnia, but in so many other cases, airstrikes aren't sufficient, and we know training troops over there sometimes doesn't work. One of the statistics that we heard today is that we have trained at 938,000 Iraqis, and at a cost of about $20 billion, and yet look what's happened to them.
Right.
Really nothing.
So just to be clear, so you think, you agree with Paul Ryan that ground troops should not be taken off the table, that should be a possibility in the future?
I think it should be a possibility, and I also think there's a strategic reason you want to leave it on the table, because we don't want to broadcast to our enemies everything that we're thinking.
Would you then support some kind of authorization that would grant the possibility of American ground troops back in Iraq or in Syria as a matter of a sort of authorization for military force?
I think that the way the military force resolutions are worded gives the president broad authority, as it should give the president broad authority to do what needs to be done to accomplish the mission. And in this case, the mission, as I understand it, is to disrupt, degrade, and to defeat ISIS. And in order to accomplish that mission, he's got to have a lot of flexibility.
Can I ask you an honest question here, Congressman? Frank question. Do you ever, on these matters, and when you're talking about this massively complicated situation, do you ever think to yourself, I have no idea? Like, I have no idea, and none of us have any idea walking around these halls of Congress?
I think that's a very good question, Chris. I think anybody who has seriously been involved and looked at the Middle East stuff has to have that moment, or those moments, when you're dealing with it, because we seem to get it wrong. You know, Colin Powell said very famously 13 years ago, if you break it, you own it.
Yeah.
And, you know, when he said it, he wasn't the most popular guy in town, and yet here we are. And that's why the president, by the way, is saying he doesn't need further authorization from Congress, because the 2002 authorization is almost where we are today.
Congressman Jack Kingston, I appreciate you coming on tonight, Congressman. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Joining me now, Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut. Senator, you took to the floor today to sort of outline your basic vision of this. It more or less seems to line up with the president's, and more or less seems to be around where the kind of consensus is forming. But your biggest concern seems to be about the training component. Talk to me about that.
Well, I just don't believe that a strategy to effectively confront ISIS necessarily has to get us enmeshed in the Syrian civil war. It's more complicated now than it was a year ago. There is more intertanglement between the so-called moderate rebels and some of the very, very bad extremist groups like al-Nusra. And so I think that we can take the fight to ISIS without risking essentially being counterproductive to national security interests by ultimately getting involved in a sectarian civil war inside Syria that we may lose. But I'm proud of the president for taking his time, putting together what I thought was a thoughtful strategy. I disagree with going into Syria, and for his statements about taking ground troops off the table. You essentially have to have taken a nap for the last 10 years to believe that a massive deployment of ground troops by the United States in Iraq is going to do the job. It is in part what created the impetus for the creation of ISIL in the first place, and the president's right to be looking to other ways to take on this foe.
Were you surprised to hear that today? I have to say, I was Congressman Fleming's statement was particularly jarring for me. I was surprised to hear that, but I was generally surprised that there seems to be people coalescing around the idea that that's the answer to this.
Yeah, old habits die hard for neoconservatives. I mean, they have always had a very singular view of how the United States exercises power around the world. They believe that we act with the military first and everything else second, third, and fourth. And if you've learned anything about the Middle East over the last 10 years, is that the blunt force of American military power really does nothing to change the reality on the ground. To the extent it does, it's only temporary until we leave. And so I agree with the president that there is a military component to taking on ISIS, but it's with the United States playing a supporting role, not as a lead role, as my friend John McCain and many others appear to want.
I want to ask you the question I just asked Congressman Kingston, and it has to do with the very specific thing about knowledge, intimate local knowledge, right? Which is, we now are going to have 535 members of Congress, we have a White House talking about what we're going to do in the midst of a massively complicated situation that is highly determined by a whole set of local factors, cultural, linguistic, religious traditions that are coming into conflict with each other. I mean, how many fluent Arabic speakers are there working on this issue in the staffing the halls of Congress of the 535? 10, 15, 20? I mean, do we know enough to not do this terribly?
Well, but you're outlining the difficulty of a citizen legislature to begin with, right? Whether we're debating policy in the Middle East or healthcare policy or judicial policy, none of us are experts on all of these fields.
But Senator, you can talk to your constituents about healthcare, and you can talk to your constituents about the pollution that might be in your water, and you can talk to them about food stamps, but you can't talk to them about what the situation is on the ground in Syria.
Well, listen, I think that's the reason why, if it were up to me here, I would argue to divide the case. I think the question of ISIS is pretty simple. This would be the first autonomous terrorist state in the modern post-9/11 era. We should do everything possible to stop that. Syria is a very difficult question and a very different, complex question. I don't think we can predict how that is going to play out. I don't think that we can predict with any confidence that the rebels, even with arms and training assistance from the United States, are going to be able to prevail. And so when I think that when there's that amount of uncertainty in the Syrian civil war, that is, I think, when our default position should be to stay out. But when it comes to ISIS, I do think that that's a pretty clear threat. And I think the American people know enough about that to be right in their mandate that we do something about it.
Senator Chris Murphy, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Joining me now, Anne Marie Slaughter, President and CEO of New America and former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. Anne Marie, it's great to see you. You were in the State Department making a number of very difficult calls, including around Libya. And I think Syria had sort of started, the Arab Spring had started while you were there. What's your reaction to the plan that the President laid out?
Well, Chris, it's great to hear you. So I have been very, very critical of the president's policy on Syria for 2.5 years, arguing that the Syrian civil war was going to spin out of control, that we were seeing the formation of very, very extreme groups, that we were seeing the destabilization of neighboring countries, et cetera. But even with all that criticism, I think he got it right last night. I think at this point, we do have to focus on ISIL. We have to protect Americans. We have to protect our allies, Europeans. We have to degrade ISIL. Whether or not we can actually destroy it, I think, is a harder question. I disagree with Senator Murphy with respect. I think there's no question we have to strike in Syria as well as in Iraq. Otherwise, you're just hitting them in half their territory and letting them retreat to the others. But I also think the president got it right that we can't do this without an Iraqi government that is willing to include different groups of Iraqis, and critically that there must be a regional coalition alongside of us.
But this always sounds to me, well, two things here. One, everyone says this. Everyone, the White House says it. The Congress says it. We need the Iraqi government that'll do X. But why are we to believe, al-Abadi, who's been in power now for, what, 7 days, oh, this is going to be the guy to do it, this time the power sharing, all the same fundamental issues around this sectarian division and who has power and who is on the outs are the same that we saw in the Civil War and that we tried to conquer with the Awakening and the Surge, etc. Well, what faith does anyone have that this is going to be the new inclusive one? I mean, you have people that were ground under the heel of tyranny who've been spending decades waiting for the moment when they can seize power. Like, what are we expecting they're going to do?
Well, look, none of us have loved the Iraqi government, but actually the government was holding together. It was radically imperfect, but until Maliki went all out, essentially, for the dominance not only of Shiite factions, but of his party, you had a halting, radically imperfect, but nevertheless functioning political process. Now what you have is the state coming apart, and the difference is we have real leverage. I mean, the president did this right. He made clear we're not going to help you unless you are willing, in fact, to reach out to the Sunnis yourselves. And if they don't do that, and this is very important, then fine, we go back to protecting American interests and humanitarian assistance. So if they want us in the game, they're going to have to do their part. And the president, that's why we shouldn't go all in. It would be crazy to go all in part because, as Senator Murphy said, the best way to drum up support for ISIL is to land American ground troops and declare war, essentially, on the Islamic State with troops. But the other point is we want absolutely to have ongoing leverage on the Iraqi government and, frankly, on neighbors.
Anne-Marie Slaughter, thank you. It's great to see you.
Great.
What would it take for 32 NFL owners to turn against the league's commissioner, Roger Goodell? Maybe news Goodell knew exactly what happened in that elevator when he decided to only suspend Ray Rice for 2 games. That's ahead.